The fine-tuning argument is the argument that the universe was perfectly finely tuned. All the physical constants were perfectly, exactly arranged to allow life to exist. Well, it's not entirely true. The physical constants were perfectly arranged to make a perfect black hole generator. And this is, for example, this is one of the little pieces of evidence that I find very intriguing. And this has been demonstrated by Dr. Lee Smolin, who showed that this universe is the best possible universe you could ever design for maximizing the production of black holes. So there's more black holes in this universe than any other universe you could come up with by mixing up the physical constants or the number of subatomic particles, which is another curious thing, that the number of subatomic particles and their properties is exactly what they would need to be to maximize black hole production. Now, if you think about it, 99.99999% of this universe is absolutely lethal to life. It's deadly radiation-filled vacuum. 99.99999% of all the matter in the universe goes to making black holes, not life-bearing worlds. I mean, for every life-bearing world, I'm sure there's trillions of black holes in this universe. So what would be the obvious conclusion? This universe was designed to make black holes. It wasn't designed for us. And Smolin also shows, by showing this, he shows that a universe that was perfectly designed to make black holes would just happen to kick up life at random. It would just happen, it's necessarily the case that the only way to make a universe that would be a perfect black hole generator is to make one that would occasionally, very rarely, create a little tiny microscopic speck of life as a byproduct. So really the Christian design argument would lead you to conclude that God built the universe for black holes, not for us, and we're just sort of an accidental byproduct, even from that perspective.
Thanks, God.
And it's so unnecessary. For example, and this is one of the things that I'm bringing out in a new article I'm writing for someone about my reasons for not being a Christian. And the opposite would be the case. If the Christian God were true, if the Christian God existed, the universe would be pretty much the way Paul and the other early Christians really thought it was. It would be one solar system, not zillions of galaxies, not billions of years old. We would have tons of evidence that we could find eventually that the whole cosmos was created, 6,000-10,000 years ago. We wouldn't have any evidence of evolution. They didn't know anything about evolution or the evidence for it. We wouldn't have all of these things. We wouldn't need these physical constants. We wouldn't need all these subatomic particles. We would only need the 5 elements that Paul and Aristotle thought there were, not the 90 or so elements that we've actually found, and so on and so forth. The Earth would be the center of the universe. I mean, why would God make it any other way? I mean, it's the center of his attention. It's the purpose for which everything was created. It makes sense that he would make it the center of the universe, and that's what Aristotle and Paul and everybody thought. Is like, well, yeah, it makes sense. Well, it turns out not to be true. So the universe we would expect if the Christian God existed is not the universe we get. We get this really bizarre, extremely strange, complicated universe that's almost entirely devoted to producing black holes and is actually optimally arranged to produce black holes. The human brain has to be really huge, has to be really large to be able to perform this complex function called consciousness. But it's so large, it has to be so large, in fact, that it kills 1 out of 5 women who give birth without modern medicine to help them. So that's a really messy design, a bad design. I mean, you wouldn't want to make something that babies kill their mothers 1 out of every 5 times. And there are many other problems.
God might have mother issues.
Yeah,
you
might have
know.
mother issues. Yeah, and there are other problems. The brain is a huge hog. I mean, it sucks up all the oxygen and all the energy, tons amount of oxygen and energy. So you're wasting a lot of your breathing and eating and so forth just to feed this brain. So it's very inefficient. And it's very vulnerable to injury. I mean, it's a very delicate organ. If it gets injured, your whole cognitive functions can be hugely damaged. You can lose your sight, you could lose your reason, and you could lose control of your emotions. I mean, it's a very vulnerable organ. It's not what a God would design. And God wouldn't need to design this, because if a God exists, then obviously a mind can exist without a body, because God is without a body. So we could have minds without brains. We don't need brains. God could just give us a soul, like the Christians actually think we have. And if we had a soul, and it did all the actual consciousness and perceiving and thinking, we wouldn't need a brain. So we wouldn't have to kill our mothers. We wouldn't have to have this organ that's sucking up all our energy and making our bodies very inefficient. We wouldn't have this delicate organ that could easily be injured and ruin our cognitive faculties and so forth. There would be no need for that brain. But if God does not exist, in fact, if it's impossible for a mind to exist without a fleshy organ to create it, then it necessarily follows that the only way to have a conscious being is to have this large, messy, vulnerable brain. So isn't it surprising that on the assumption that there's no such thing as a disembodied mind, it necessarily predicts that the only way there could be a mind is to have this complex brain. Lo and behold, we have this huge complex brain. And yet, on the Christian theory, we expect the exact opposite. We expect to have souls, not brains. Well, why do we even need brains? We need brains if atheism is true. So the existence of large brains is positive proof that atheism is true. But, and because, you know, if the Christian God would build something differently. Now, the Christian will respond to try to make up excuses for why God made the brain, but you know, these excuses are just pulled out of thin air, and they don't really rescue the theory. It's still the fact that the only way atheism can be true is if we have these large brains. We have these large brains, that's evidence for atheism. It might not be proof, might not settle the issue, but it's evidence for it. And if God had some weird reason to do this, then it means that God had some weird reason to make the universe look exactly like it would have to look if God did not exist. And that seems highly improbable.
So atheism is a lack of belief?
Yes, that's my position. There are some atheists, well, usually it's agnostics, who insist on calling themselves agnostics, who insist that atheism is denial of the existence of God, and there are Christians that do the same thing.
An atheist is just an agnostic who's thought about it.
Yeah.
Right?
I would say so, and I will say, you know, I'm an atheist partly because I'm an agnostic.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's a lack of belief. There's nothing there, so why do anything, though? I don't understand. Why not? And people ask all the time. Why?
Yeah.
I mean, sure, I'm an atheist too, but why do you make a point of? Why do you make a crusade at it?
Well, to me, philosophy is very important. I mean, it is my religion, and I take it as seriously as a Christian takes his religion. And philosophy, to me, is the objective of trying to understand yourself, understand the universe, understand your place in the universe. And it's to understand what exists, how does it work, what do we do about it now? And that, to me, is very important. It's something everyone should pursue. You know, I think people should abandon religion and pursue philosophy, and pursue it the way Socrates and Aristotle pursued it, with questioning, with trying to find out what the truth is, you know, constantly questioning, constantly checking the facts, constantly trying to integrate everything into a coherent worldview. And that's what my book, Sense and Goodness, is about. Is I take everything I know and I show that, you know, all this research I've done over all these years has led me to believe that naturalism is the correct worldview, and I lay out what that is and why I believe it's the correct worldview. And it leads to a lot of conclusions about what kind of political views you should have, what kind of moral values you should have, how we should investigate things, the value of science, for example. Even everyday life. I mean, how do we decide what stories we're going to believe? You know, we're reading a journalist, listening to a politician. Everything about the way you go through life, how you decide what to believe, how you investigate claims, how you conduct your life, all comes from your philosophy of life, whether you know it or not. And that's what my book is presenting, the atheist, or an atheist philosophy of life. It's a view of the world that is a positive assertion about what exists and it's what the nature of it is, called naturalism. And it just happens to be an atheistic philosophy because there's no God in it. There are other atheistic philosophies, of course. I mean, people will tell you about Marxism and objectivism and so forth. I don't buy any of those. I go into naturalism, the secular, or the ethical part of which is secular humanism. And that's what my book defends. And I think it's very important for people to explore these things. And I always wanted to write this book. I mean, even from my high school days, even though I had a completely different philosophy of life then, I wanted to write a book that conveyed a philosophy of life that people could come up and go and read and decide whether, you know, is that right or wrong, or maybe I'll change some things. That's the kind of thing I've always wanted to do, and that's what I'm doing now. And of course, through all my investigations, I've ended up in a different place than I thought I would. But yeah, that's why I do that. And of course, that butts me up against the Christians who say I'm wrong.
You wrote a review of Earl Doherty's book, The Jesus Puzzle.
Right.
In which you said basically there's no good refutation of this argument. It should stand for now until there is one. Is that inaccurate?
No. What I said was agnosticism is the correct position now. What had been the problem before is that historicity is usually presumed, that if you have all this documentation of someone's existence, that's usually enough. They existed, probably. And that's fine enough as far as it goes. And the Christians have some particular pieces of evidence that they can offer that support, don't prove, but support the theory that there really was a Jesus. Mm-hmm. What Doherty did was came out and explained all the evidence, even the weird evidence, which is impressive because that's something a lot of the Christians can't do. Even the weird evidence, explained it all with this other theory that entails that there was no physical Jesus. So his theory is completely consistent with the facts, which means that we can't now decide whether Doherty's right or the Christians are right. We can't pick sides yet because we don't have the evidence we need. We don't have the smoking gun. Theoretically, we could. I mean, we could find a lost letter of Paul that says, I made it all up, or that says something to the effect that Jesus didn't exist physically on earth. That could happen, and that would vindicate Doherty's theory. That would be like the extreme example. I mean, you could have other minor pieces of evidence that could tend in that direction. We don't have that yet. So my view is that we can't be sure whether Jesus did or did not exist, and that's what I argue in my review of Doherty. Since I wrote that review, however, I've been studying more the writing of the New Testament, the Gospels especially, the symbolism that's employed in the construction of the Gospels. And I did this mainly, especially when I was researching my chapter for The Empty Tomb. There's this anthology of writers on the resurrection called The Empty Tomb that's coming out in a few months. And I have 3 chapters in that, one of which is the spiritual body of Christ and the legend of the empty tomb, where I lay out all the evidence, I mean more than I've laid out anywhere else, that the original Christian belief was not that Jesus walked out of the grave. The original Christian belief was that Jesus got a new, better body and left the old body behind. The old body was destroyed or rotted in the grave or whatever. Now this view is also compatible with the idea that Jesus never existed on earth, because it's the same idea. He would come down, get a body of flesh, shed the body of flesh, jump into a body of spirit, and rise again. So it's compatible with both theories. But in researching this, I studied how Mark, for example, constructed the empty tomb story, and I found some astonishing things. The sort of symbolism that he was using explains almost every detail of it in a way that you'd almost just say it's almost impossible that this would be historically true. That Mark himself probably did not believe he was writing history. He was writing a symbolic message. He was writing a gospel, the good news, and symbolizing it using biblical parallels, using parallels to pagan religions and so forth. When I saw that, and I've seen it more and more places in the New Testament. For example, even Luke, who I think really did think he was writing history, even Luke tells this story about the 2 guys on the road to Emmaus who meet Jesus in disguise. It's many attributes of that story are almost an exact inversion of the Romulus story. There's a story, there was the founding myth of Rome that Romulus was a god descended and became a man and founded Rome, and then was killed, torn apart by the Senate, executed, and then rose again, and then appeared to his friend Proculus on the road to Alba Longa from Rome, and told him basically, if the Romans are virtuous, they will have a great empire, and explains the whole story. I was a god, I came down to found this great empire, blah blah blah. And they actually had annual ceremonies celebrating this myth. And the Luke story of the road to Emmaus is very similar in many respects. I mean, curious, not so similar that you go, definitely that's what Luke is doing, but similar enough that it seems like Luke got the story from someone who was sort of aping this Romulus myth, but putting Jesus in place of Romulus. And instead of a worldly empire, is preaching a kingdom of God, an empire of God, a church where it would be the Spirit of Christ that would govern everyone rather than the use of force or whatever. And when I found lots of these things, and the more I find it, the more I find Doherty's theory attractive. Not proven, but it does seem that he can make a good case.